And welcome back to another very, very important episode of Inside Out Exploring the Roads to Redemption. I'm your co host, Dr. Lawrence, and I'm the proud executive director and founder of a nonprofit entitled A Bridge to Light. And our focus is not only to enable underserved communities to acquire human needs that were historically obstacles for them achieving their visions, but to further disrupt the school of prison pipeline, enabling the reentry of formerly incarcerated persons. And it is my honor and just gratitude to be joined by my brother and friend, our brother and friend, Mr. Thomas Cotton.
Brother Lawrence, Dr. Lawrence, I really appreciate that. Glad to be here. It's an honor to be able to do this podcast with you also. We have been able to do a lot of good things in the last few months with this podcast, and it's been an honor. So I just want to say thank you. Again, my name is Thomas Cotton. I'm the founder and CEO of Redemption and Advancement Alliance, where our mission is to disrupt the cycles of incarceration. And we do this by focusing on the most important part, the person. The person, if they're not changed, nothing changes. So, we really want to make sure that the individual is able to be cared for, elevated, and trained in a way that helps them to become their own change that they want to see. So thank you again for joining us for our next episode. We get to follow up with last week's episode. And in order to do this, we want to make sure that you like, share, subscribe. Make sure you get that notification when our next podcast comes up, so you're never behind on all the information that we have to present.
Thomas, I love how your organization is just focused on change, focused on transformation of the individual. Granted, it's limited things that we could do with respect to the external environment, but how do we focus on the internal environment, the person? And I love how you're focused on that. And just speaking of transformation, just to bring our viewers up to speed, quickly up to speed, what we talked about last episode was I had the opportunity of being the keynote speaker at the North Texas Veterans Association Mental Health Summit, and it was focused on finding joy in life's transitions. And I took it a step further with respect to my journey from combat to compassion. And there was a similarity when I was speaking to that group. I illuminated similarities between returning veterans and returning formerly incarcerated persons into society. And you and I spoke specifically to the structural piece, and this episode will speak more with respect to the structural issues and speak to prayerfully the individual and how do we enable transformation within that environment. So with that, let's speak to some more structural issues that you've identified.
So when last show you left off talking about the war machine and how the person who's trained to go into combat and their mindset is a certain way, and as they begin to transition out, they get a small amount of training to transition out. And we were going to make the comparison to the person who's incarcerated as a war machine also. Because if we think about prison's gladiator school. Prison has so many different things inside of it that can break a person. It's whether it's violence, physical violence, mental violence, structural violence, whatever type of violence is inside this system, there's nothing that really cares for the person, the individual, while they're in there. And so as they prepare to transition out, they still have all these days that they have to live inside this environment. And on any given day, violence can happen. On any given day, violence can happen to you for no reason. On any given day, someone can wake up on the wrong side of the bed because they hear bad information, and now they're looking at taking it out on anybody. Prison is a volatile environment, and it doesn't matter if it's a minimum security facility or maximum. Maximum has a lot more volatile situations for sure. But when you start thinking about prison, prison is prison. And when you start thinking about the way you have to gear up your mind to live in this environment every single day, and the care that's necessary and needed to transition out of this environment and the lack thereof, it can be a very hard, psychological, stressful situation in the transition period. And so that's a lot of times why we see people who we call them institutionalized. And we start thinking about the institutionalization of a person because that's the way they had to live for so much time. And I think it would be similar to the military. Would you think?
Oh, absolutely. When as you were talking, what just ran through my mind was sometimes just a combat environment or a unique environment, a hostile environment is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And in some rooms, we call that VUCA, VUCA, VUCA environments. They're volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And in combat, in Afghanistan, Iraq, there was a lot of VUCA going on. And I'm sure there's a lot of VUCA environments throughout the prisons of the United States. So again, volatile, uncertain. We can't predict what's going on. As you mentioned, someone might wake up on the wrong side of the bed while in prison X, and or while they're on base XYZ, and just based on the stresses, the pressures, the anxieties, the pains, the fears, they make a choice that sometimes is not for the benefit of the whole community. So,
Yeah,
and speaking of that, you and I also spoke about isolation,
isolation.
isolation,
Mhm.
I've experienced isolation that very different from those who are formerly incarcerated. But there's degrees, I guess, we could speak to with respect to isolation. When you can't access uh, loved ones, family, friends, like you and I were talking about a little while ago. I had the unluck of losing my mother while I was in a language school, and I had to take an examination, a language examination, a very hard language that was along the Arabic, way of manner of speaking. I had to take it over the phone
Mhm.
because that it was mandatory that I take the test during this period, and everybody else took the test in person because they were at the place where the school was at. But I had to actually attend my mother's funeral. So soon thereafter, I found myself in Pakistan,
Mhm.
isolated from my friends and family, not even allowed to grieve properly over the loss of my mother. And I'm sure there's situations that we can overlay, not necessarily very neatly, but we can overlay that situation with our brothers and sisters who are incarcerated.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of times where people lose family members. Um, I served as a chaplain, a volunteer chaplain in jails before, and having to deliver information to someone who's incarcerated and they can't do anything about it. I have to tell them that their family members passed away, a loved one's passed away, or someone's in very sick and it doesn't look good for them. Trying to deliver that information to somebody who can't do anything about it. They're helpless, hopeless. They're isolated, and it's a hard bit of information, but that's where we see the humanity of people. That's where we start to see that everybody has a human side of them, and having to try to comfort someone in that situation, helping them try to grieve when they can't go back and show this weakness in the same facility. They can't go back and say, and cry in front of people or whatnot, or show any kind of weakness because it's frowned upon. It's not looked upon as a strength, especially in this gladiator environment. And so being in when I was incarcerated, my grandfather passed away. And I didn't find out that my grandfather passed away until the day after he was buried, because it's hard to get information in sometimes to certain prisons. And for me, I wasn't able to get this information. And to grieve, fortunately, I was able to grieve in my way, the way I looked at life and everything, and it didn't impact me. But I know so many people who've been in the same situation, and their hands are tied. They try to get uh, the ability to go to the funeral or the service. Cost a lot of money to try to do that. The security it's going to take, the amount of resources that it's going to take, and then whatever your security level is, that's what's going to matter also. And a
Yeah.
lot of times the answer is just no. And so when we think about being, military service people being stationed away from family, a lot of times prisoners are separated from their family, isolated, disconnected from society, and now they have another trauma on top of trauma that they have to deal with.
Wow. Powerful. Like, share, subscribe, engage. This conversation, we could, within an hour, 2 hours, 5 hours, we could not exhaust the depth of this conversation. This conversation is so very important because although we're looking at formerly incarcerated persons and military persons and the similarities of the challenges they face reentering society, there are we just utilize this as an example with other communities that experience challenges re-entering unique situations. So this is like a model, maybe, or an example of what we're talking about. We can utilize this. You can utilize this as an example to further facilitate understanding of the issues that underserved communities face. Re-entering society and so forth. So please engage us, share, like, dislike. Uh, don't agree. It's fine because we're in an environment. We want to learn together. We want to learn together because your positioning can further enable us to learn better. So with that, we spoke to the structural piece, a little bit more of the structural piece. We're going to get more and more in the structural piece in future shows. But can we speak to the reentry or the individual piece even more so as far as addictions, homelessness, mental healthness, PTSD, TBI, and where do I start? Where do I start? I just did 8 years in ex prison. I just did 8 years in ex military. Where do I start to reenter society?
Yeah. When we think about that word, reenter society, I just did this amount of time in prison. I just did this amount of time in the military. And then once you're released from prison, I'll just talk about it from this side. There's a newfound freedom. You're free. You don't have the same other things that you had before. This can be disorienting. This is not something that just don't look at freedom as free. I don't look at freedom as free. I tell people in class all the time, your freedom, don't look at it as you're free. You have new freedoms, plural. There's freedoms that are afforded to you now. But the disorienting factor of going from this world to a new world, the expectations of this new world, the responsibilities, and trying to fit into new structural social norms is often hard. You know, outside of the structured environment, you have people who don't understand what it looks like as a former prisoner to really walk in this freedom. They just know they're free to do whatever. So whatever their appetite is desiring at that moment is available to them. And if they're not capable of making strong decisions, or they haven't been uh, educated on the reasons why they should make these strong decisions, they don't make the best decisions at times. And that goes for people coming out of the military and people coming out of prison. That's how come we have people with employment challenges. There's the employment challenges, substance abuse, as you said, there's mental health challenges. The very act of freedom can create a mental health challenge. I want you to
Wow.
think about it. The
Wow.
very act of freedom can create a mental health challenge. And so we have to be aware of these things. And the reason why we find so many of our veterans coming out and formerly incarcerated people coming out with these mental health challenges, because that freedom is something different for everybody.
You said something very, very powerful there. The lack of freedom creates what?
The very act of freedom,
The very act
act
of
of freedom creates mental health challenges.
So that lack of structure, that lack of coercion, that constant pressure against you to mold the clay accordingly. Now the clay is, let's say, okay, mold yourself. The clay is like, wait a minute, hold on. I need a potter.
Right.
I need a potter. I need somebody to help mold me. And now all of a sudden, now the freedom, in the pressures and anxieties and fears and depressions, and more fear and uncertainty, ambiguity, the VUCA of life, the
Right.
VUCA of freedom. We just coined something. Trademark.
Hey, I've been thinking about, since you said VUCA,
Yeah.
putting a shirt together that says VUCA happens.
What happens? Absolutely. But VUCA, a VUCA environment in which one who was in a very controlled, coercive, disciplined, structured environment, now they enter the VUCA environment outside the gates, outside the gate of Fort XYZ, outside the gate of prison XYZ. Now life happened. Now life started happening. And now we're faced, as you mentioned, depression, mental illnesses. But they probably had mental illnesses while they were behind the gate, while were at Fort XYZ, and the particular treatment or reintegration process was not specifically tailored to them, to enable them, the individual, not this group of reentering personnel from prison XYZ or military XYZ, but this person to reenter society in a more seamless manner. That's in a seamless manner. That's what can create anxiety, people being hyper vigilant and so forth. And just again, as we mentioned, um, homelessness, homelessness, illness, contagious diseases, chronic diseases, uh, based on based on homelessness, based on drug addiction, based on other titles that we got reenter society. How does that influence the stories people tell themselves about the reentering, reentering former incarcerated person and or military person, which supports, again, the top of the triangle of violence directed towards that person. He's homeless. He's a drug addict. She's a this. He's a that. He has TBI. So therefore, and they act like this. Therefore, the violence demonstrated to them, namely the deprivation and maldevelopment piece, is now directed towards that community.
Yeah. When we're talking about mental health here, mental health doesn't discriminate. It doesn't discriminate for people who've been in prison, people who've been in the military. It doesn't discriminate whether you're a teacher, you're a police officer. Mental health is out there.
That's right.
And a lot of times people face a lot of the same issues: depression, anxiety, PTSD, different traumas that have been experienced over time. We're talking about veterans and prisoners, formerly incarcerated people here. The veteran is combat experiences, it's the structure, it's the systems that they're involved with. And for those who have been incarcerated, there's a trauma of incarcerated, the stigmas that are associated with it. And so as we start talking about stigmas, we can't forget, we talked about isolation within being inside. There's also an isolation once you transition. For the veteran, there's
Thank you for joining us this evening, and stand by for our next episode where we go further into the similarities between returning veterans and formerly incarcerated persons into society. Thank you.